And I think, like most people who would call themselves Christian, my conceptions of what that has involved have changed from the time I was a kid, living in Africa where my parents were missionaries, Baptist missionaries, mostly setting up schools and the sort, but raised in that kind of pietist evangelical background where, you know, the whole idea that was very popular in that strand of Christianity was this idea of a personal relationship with Jesus and a real idea of the kind of atoning blood of Christ as saving you from eternal damnation and allowing you to have that great relationship with God again. But you know, years of rebelling against some of that and doing a biochemistry degree and a degree in comparative religion, you know, it changes the way you think about these things. So even if at the end of a life you are still in that tradition, my ways of thinking about what it means to be a Christian in terms of relationships with other people or the kind of life that you ought to live, the way in which you interact with others or empower others, the way that you pound people over the head has changed. And so I think I feel like I'm a kinder, gentler person maybe than I was even as a young kid. But I recognize that being a Christian, there are many different routes and ways of thinking about Jesus, which I'm sure we'll talk about tonight. And I think all of us play with a few of those at the same time.
Do you have a regular practice of prayer or meditation where you tune into higher guidance?
I wouldn't say a really regular one, but I would say I kind of miss not having a real regular one. And so I actually just booked my tickets for my first Celtic spirituality 10-day retreat next year. And I think it'll be an interesting experience for a person who's maybe been pretty busy for the last 40 years, and sometimes things get tuned out. It might be time to begin to explore some of those channels that have been floating through the tradition for maybe about the last 1,700 years.
If you were explaining to children, let's say elementary school age, the meaning of Christmas, what would you say? What was the impact of Jesus' message?
I would say two things. I would say it's a message that God is love, and it's a message that you ought to love others, and the way you do that is by showing it in action.
What's an example of something that Jesus did that kind of typifies that for you?
I would much rather this last week have been spending the evening reading at home and writing, but I did some work at the shelters with the folks who are shut out from Paradise, and not in order to get a pat on the back or in order to run up brownie points. I kind of did it in spite of the fact that I didn't always want to go there, because in the tradition I come out of, that's the commandment.
Is to serve
and to do for others. And so even sometimes it's great and sometimes you don't want to do it, but it is something that I think is mandated to interrupt your regular life in any small way.
For people who are listening who aren't in North State, you probably read in the news anyway about the Butte County fire. It's called the Camp Fire. So Joel's talking about the 20,000 new people that are in Chico who had their homes burned down. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Greg, what about you, your journey?
I might just say, first of all, that I teach comparative religion and humanities at Chico State, as does Joel, by the way. And before that, I was a pastor in Presbyterian churches for 18 years. My journey's a little funny. I grew up in a secular home. I went to UC Berkeley, and I became a Christian. So that should sound like the beginning of a joke, I think. And maybe it was. I don't know. Maybe it's a divine joke or something. So since that point, because it was fairly fresh, and I was an 18-year-old when I became a Christian. It took me a ways until I began to practice church ministry as a pastor. Was originally in retail for a few years with my wife Laura, and then I went to seminary at Princeton, and then to seminary in Berkeley at the Graduate Theological Union. Started pastoring in New York City, and then here in Chico for 12 years, and then transitioned to becoming doing my work, which I see as a ministry in a certain sense with my students here at Chico State. I think I might have varied from your question to my more professional status. So for me, I think I think it was more about following Jesus, if I remember the question. Is that right? As a Christian?
Your personal relationship.
Yeah. So for me, when I first became a Christian, it was definitely one of those born-again experiences. And I was actually challenged to give that testimony, as the technical language goes, on the To the Best of Our Knowledge show a few weeks back. And it was really interesting to go back to 1981 and when I became a Christian at age 18. It was a very decisive moment for me. It was about wrestling with the truths of who Jesus was, reading the Bible, also some other Christian thinkers like C.S. Lewis and other people, and being very personally and existentially gripped by the message and by the person of Jesus. So since then, I think there's been a lot of ways that that's played out. As far as my more outward-facing side, it's to try to help other people to enter into the love we know the love of God we know through Jesus Christ, and how people can experience that, and then also experience it through giving it to other people as well.
When you were 18, were you in a church when you had that conversion experience, or what was the setting?
Yeah. Well, I was going to church at the time. That's probably the biggest reason I became a Presbyterian, was I was going to a really dynamic Presbyterian church, First Presbyterian Church of Berkeley. Excuse me. That had a very positive culture-facing side to the way they understood their faith. So that's always been a big part of what I was doing. But for me, it was also very personal, like when I actually confessed my faith, or in the technical language, received Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. I was by myself, actually. I just hit Joel, by the way. I accidentally, not purposely. I climbed a hill up in Berkeley, looked the Bay Area, and came to a place of confessing my faith. So, in other words, there's a lot of individual searching for me, and conversations with friends, and so on.
So, do you think that once you have that salvation experience, that's kind of saves your soul? Or because there's a controversy of doing works or faith, and Catholics have tended to maybe do more with works. So what does that guarantee you? Is it an insurance policy?
Right, yeah. I don't know if I didn't really ever have the very strong hell message that I was in a evangelically oriented mainline Presbyterian church, but I never really had the strong hell message, of you're being saved from, say, eternal damnation. So that wasn't particularly my experience. For me, it was actually more of looking for meaning in life and looking for something that would bring together various threads. Another way to say, Gail, if this is not actually answering your question directly, but I hope it answers in a different way, is that for me, I think I was going through that early adulthood desire to find out what did I believe. Yeah, and was I rejecting what my parents in some ways didn't believe? Like, they did not have a faith at all. So for me, my kind of subverting my parents' viewpoints was to become a Christian, perhaps. So I think that was really an important part of that conversion. In terms of my own salvation or other people's salvation, and we can get into this at whatever level you want to, but I tend to see that when you look at Jesus Christ in the way that the Christian church has understood him as fully God and fully human, that shows how much God cares for us and loves us, and that Jesus really is the representative for all humanity. So that's how we start, I think, as human beings, is we start within the embrace and love of God as it's expressed in the person of Jesus Christ.
And some, I would say, extreme churches say that if you don't accept Jesus Christ, you're going to go to hell.
Yeah.
So is that your understanding, that there's only one way to God? That's
not how I understand it. I'm not in that kind of fundamentalist camp myself. Although I am Christ-focused. That's where I do believe God has definitively revealed himself. Now, teaching comparative religion, I understand there's great truths in that we can see of God in other religious traditions as well. Again, I'd love to unfold that, but basically my answer would be for you, no, I don't see it that way entirely. I don't see it that way entirely, and we can talk about it more, perhaps, yeah.
I want to ask you one more question now. When you were pastor, what were there themes and why people came to you and said, Pastor Greg, I'm suffering, I'm worried about this, help me understand this? Were there patterns?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that was really interesting for me is people come to church often for fellowship, meaning community, and for being within a narrative, and for helping them with very practical life crises or issues, divorce or marriage, friendship, depression, or happiness, meaning, and all those sorts of things. From the outside, church often looks like it's about, spiritual disciplines and doctrine, but from the inside, church looks a lot about ritual and narrative, meaning stories we live in, and also community. So I think people often came to me when I was a pastor with all kinds of different issues that were very personal and weren't necessarily theological on the surface at any level. I was involved a lot with college and post-college people. So in the classic Freudian framework of, at that age you're looking for love and work, I had a number of conversations about what should I do with my life, work, and whom should I love, and what's this relationship I'm in about. So those were the presenting issues most often.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Sister Gloria, how come you're a sister?
Why am I a sister?
Uh-huh.
Why am I a Sister of Mercy?
Yes.
Why have I been a Sister of Mercy for 60 years?
Exactly, that's my question.
Okay. I grew up in, I often jokingly refer to it as the Catholic ghetto, a small Catholic town, rural town in Iowa. So I grew up in the church, going to Catholic schools with the sacraments. But why did I enter? Because I answered, when they asked us, why do we want to asked me, why do we want to come to Sister of Mercy? I said, to serve God in the best way I know. And I would say, after all these years, I might say, to serve God and God's people in the best way I know. And others may have written paragraphs. As I understand it, they wrote paragraphs and I wrote one sentence. But it's been enough fuel to keep going for a long time.
How old were you when you first entered the order?
I was after a one-year college. I went to the college. I didn't know the Sisters of Mercy, but I went to the college 1 year, and I finally gave up the struggle. When I was young, I wanted to be a sister until I discovered boys, and then it was attention, and then finally I just decided then, because a couple of friends were going to enter, and I had kind of an experience like you're going up to overlooking the city. I went outside and I think I prayed, don't remember. I was at the college and I looked up at now I know it was the community room, and I saw one of the sisters' hand goes up to turn the blinds, and I said, do I want to join them? And it was, yes. Okay. So then I got into music education, mainly education in schools, administration, and then a few other ministries since then at varying degrees. And I think that the way I've grown and what I've learned in each one has added on to the next ministry, if that makes any sense. Am I answering
You've
your
been
question?
a teacher and an administrator in schools,
Yes,
right?
actually, I was a teacher in Colorado at a couple schools, and then in my late 20s came out to Red Bluff. Was teaching at Mercy High School, and then I became the principal because there wasn't anybody else. So I started, we're centralized in Omaha, in the Midwest, and then I had started a degree, a master's in theology, because it was right around the time of Vatican II, and I asked the order, I said, I can't continue teaching religion unless I have a better understanding of theology. And so I started in theology, and then when I became an administrator, I says, I better start on a master's in administration so I know something of what to do. And then, so those were kind of happening at the same time. I did not teach religion after I became an administrator, but it's the master's in theology, I kind of think, was more of a personal advancement for me, where if you say, I think I was thinking about this, it's been an evolution from Jesus Christ to Jesus the Christ to the cosmic Christ.
Could you explain that? That's interesting.
Oh, that's a long. I think Christ is like, it's the Christ. It isn't Jesus' last name.
It's a consciousness, a spirit.
It's the anointed one. Jesus is the anointed one.
And his purpose
And if I
is to
did it
do, anointed
to
to
be
do
the
what?
personal revelation of God. A God of love loves us enough to become one of us and gives us a way, an example, and a hope that we will return that love, not just to God, but to each other and to ourselves. Is that making...
Yes. What do you think about someone in Somalia who's never heard of Jesus? What's going to happen to that person when their death, when they've committed venial and moral sins?
I think he's going to face I presume it's a he, maybe a she,
Yeah.
going to face a loving God. And I don't think in the categories that he would even be considered in the category of sin or mortal or venial. That's our Christian Catholic, approach. Think a little. His life in the afterworld will depend partly on how much love was shown in his context with whom he related to. As the seed of love of God is within each of us, we try to bring that out in whatever way, hopefully that we can. That's why I think we see the overwhelming support of people when we have a crisis. There's something good in all of us. And
Right.
sometimes, hopefully the crisis will bring that out.
It does. There's an interesting book about it that like Hurricane Katrina, there's a whole series of disasters where always people are helpful. It's too bad we have to wait till the disasters.
But when you talk about my personal relationship, is through my prayer, where I started out saying prayers. You learn the Our Father, Hail Mary, sign of the cross, and you never lose those. They are always there, and they pop up at times when you're freaking out. Well, I shouldn't say freak out, but anyway.
When you're
desperate
upset,
times.
yeah.
Yeah, sometimes it's amazing how it'll, you hear that people, either something they think they're going to die, and they went, do some of that. And I think that studying theology kind of changed the way I think about God or conceive of Him. But going on my sabbatical year, that changed my spirituality in how I actually relate. It changed the different kinds of prayer. Instead of saying a prayer, you learn to pray. Meditation, you learn about contemplation. All the the how-tos and the where-tos. The realizing that God is immanent and transcendent, and I'm trying to relate to all that. And for myself, I was exposed to and appreciated different types of prayer, using movement, using art, that kind of thing. So God becomes much more present, and this is a daily activity.
And then where does the Holy Spirit fit in all this, the Holy
It's
Ghost?
behind it all.
How so?
That's the label I think we give to that movement. We have the
To the relationship with the divine?
That's the force and the power. When we have the Trinity, those are understanding labels that we have given to a one God. And as Catholic Christians, we believe in the Trinity. And so it's just, I think, as humans, we're always trying to glean, and we always want to understand more. And that's why our understanding has grown and shifted, because we learn more. We use all the sciences, between psychology and paleontology and a few more.
Yes.
Okay. We are.
When
yes.
when you became a sister, what vows did you, like poverty,
Okay.
chastity?
Every religious takes the vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The Sisters of Mercy take a fourth vow of service. We were started by Catherine Macaulay in the early 1800s, at a time when women religious around the world, actually, mainly in Europe, were starting to leave the convents and going out to people. Otherwise, they were pretty restricted within the church. People would come to them. And Catherine Macaulay started in her 50s, started the service, the Mercy community, well, not the community service first, and then founded the order. Spiritual and corporal works of mercy, which is the world, when you think about it. And then, but she mainly focus was women, the poor, and education for in Dublin, Ireland, I didn't mention that. But so as we go through, as we were invited to different parts of the world, we met the needs that were there. If it was a school, it was a hospital, an orphanage, well, place for women that weren't married to live.
You wear a wedding ring. Did they tell you that part of your becoming a sister was that you were the bride of Christ, that you were married to Christ in a way?
I don't remember that being stressed. I don't find that phrase particularly meaningful. There's the idea of friendship, intimacy, but not bride. I guess we didn't wear the gown. I know some orders did. That was a symbolic ritual, and that meant a lot. Right now we have the Mercy Cross and the ring is what identifies us. I wore the full habit for 8 years, so I lived through that change after Vatican II to the modified habit. And so those are the growthful things that happen to you.
Did people treat you differently when you were in full habit?
Yes.
Did they go
For better and for worse.
for worse? I would think they would want you to bless them or something.
Oh, we live in the world. There have been a few. Yes. No, there is not this universal, gigantic love of women of religious.
What's interesting to me is that you never hear a story of a sister or a nun who broke her vows, but we hear about priests all the time. So I think that's clear statement that women should be allowed to be priests and do sacraments. Doesn't that follow?
Well, I don't know that follows. Some people would like to quote you. That might be it. I think that is an issue that I could hope for someday, not in my lifetime. And I think part of that within the patriarchal and the hierarchy has to do with just the position of women just in the world. You know, that's the culture that we live in. Mm-hmm. And this is as you look at the meetings of the hierarchy and you see no women, eventually I think that will change. I have that hope, but at my age, for the future. I hope for the future.
This Pope Francis is so progressive in so many ways in terms of saying Christianity is about helping the poor. It's not about rich. It's about acknowledging we're destroying the environment. So I hope, well, maybe he could be a little progressive in terms of more role for women.
Yeah, we're kind of hoping that. At least it kind of opened the door. A little bit, just might happen. Does that cover what you wanted?
Yes, it was great. Virginia, tell us about your relation with Jesus and your almost being a sister at one point.
Well, I'm happy that I was last because all the hard questions have been asked. I was 10 years old when my parents died, both of them, and I was raised by my older sibling. And when I was 18, I really wanted to do something important in my relationship with Jesus, to please him, to become closer to him, to serve him. And so at that time, I was a freshman at San Jose State, and at the end of that year, I went on a tour with a professor whom I loved dearly. He was marvelous, an atheist, and 20-some other students with only one other Christian that was there. And so I was just kind of a happy-go-lucky kid, and I didn't mind telling them that I was going to be entering the convent at the end of the tour. And so that made them very curious about this person who would do such a thing that seemed so normal. And so they were always picking my brain about my belief and in my faith. And so it was challenging for a young girl who just had the Baltimore Catechism and memorized things like, who made you and why did God make you? But believe me, those were important questions to them. And I remember one day, after we had a discussion, and they were so nice to me. I mean, we really liked each other, and they're very respectful, but they really wanted to know what made this girl tick. So after we're riding around in the bus together, we had our own private tour bus, we had a pretty, not a heated discussion, but a pretty animated one. And I remember it was all over, and I just kind of turned over to the window, and I said, Jesus, I can't prove that you are real. But they can't prove to me that you aren't either. And I just made this commitment to him of faith, that I would believe in him and follow him no matter what. And tears are running down my cheeks at that moment. It was very profound. And I felt his presence as I looked out the window. I could see in the distance the beautiful mountains of Austria. And I just felt his presence there with me and around. And for 3 days, the thought of God would always bring that to me. And it was very, very powerful. And I think it was just his way of helping me out of a very difficult spiritual situation. So I entered the convent.
Which, this was Sisters of the Sacred Blood?
Precious Blood
Precious
of Jesus, yeah. Sisters of the Precious Blood, whose mother house is in Dayton, Ohio. And I entered Christmas night, because the nuns were going back from California there to the mother house at that time.
And you're 19 or so?
I was
now?
almost 19, yeah. And I was there for almost, 8 years of formation. And I loved everything about it. I loved the liturgies, the worship, the studies, the spiritual formation, the camaraderie. I became a teacher. Loved doing that. And but when it came time to make final vows, I just felt I couldn't do that. So there was a part of me that kind of wanted to get married and have a family, and I couldn't quite shake it, no matter how hard I tried. So I left. And
How old were you roughly then?
26.
26.
Mm-hmm. And then I met a man that I had dated before that, even though I never thought about him at that time, but we got together again, and I ended up marrying him. And we just celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary this summer. So it was a good thing. And
You have 4 children?
3.
3.
Mm-hmm. A daughter and 2 sons in their 40s. And so after I was married, and I spent a great deal of time raising my children, and then I went back and got my master's degree in school counseling, and I went back to teaching, and then I retired about 10 years ago. I was a school counselor after about 20 so years of teaching.
In Catholic school or?
No, it was all public school
schools.
after I left, yes. And that's where the money was, you need it when you're raising a family. And so after I retired, I started to think about, I really want something more spiritually than what I felt I was getting in our parish. It wasn't our parish's fault or anything, but I just wanted something more. And so I discovered and was led to this lay order called, which is part of the Carmelite religious order, the secular Carmelites, secular Discalced Carmelites. The Carmelites began in the 11th century in Israel, and about 400 or 500 years later, in the 16th century, Teresa of Avila reformed what was more of a lax way of living the religious life. And so the ancient order remained their title, and they became, Teresa's group, became the Discalced Carmelites, so they're a more stricter order. But so they have the friars, they have the branch that's the nuns, and then we're the seculars, because we live in the secular world, and that's what that means. I started going to training in Sacramento from Red Bluff for the first couple of years. But in the beginning, it's quite a jaunt down there. It's
Yeah.
2-hour drive each direction.
Right.
And, I'm in my 60s, but I was really in my early 70s at that time. And my first day, I just absolutely loved it. And I'm driving home and I'm thinking, Lord, what do you want from me on this? I feel so called, but it's just really impossible because I can't do this drive. I'm getting older, if you haven't noticed. That's what's happening. And I got this, what I thought was a message. It was just something that filled my heart and mind, and it was, just keep going, because I want to use you to begin a Carmelite group in Red Bluff. And so I didn't know if that was really the Holy Spirit speaking to me without words, or it was just wishful thinking, or what it was, but I kept that tucked back in my mind. And then I kept on going, and then it's just a great story, but I don't have hours to tell you, so I ended up founding a group in Red Bluff on January 11, 2011. Easy to remember that date, 1/11/11. And we have been in existence since then. We're between 20 and 25 members, and they come, we have a couple from Chico, and several from Redding, and then Red Bluff, and Chester, and around, It's not just for Red Bluff specifically. It just seems to be a very handy point to be. And it has been a real wonderful, fulfilling experience, and I've learned a lot, and I absolutely love it. I am also very active in teaching about our faith to our adults in the past, and right now I'm focusing on children, and I love doing it. In speaking about Christmas and teaching children about Jesus, I like putting Christmas nestled in the middle of the Old and New Testament. I teach a lot. My teaching is very scripture-based, and I begin with creation, and we go through the Old Testament for the first half of the year, and then as we approach December, we're ready to talk about the Messiah that these chosen people of God have been yearning for all this time. So we kind of get into that mode of experiencing Christmas. So during the Advent season, I have made little cribs for them out of balsa wood and purchased little 3 to 4 inch Jesuses that belong in a crib, and they get a little bag of straw to go with it, and each time they do a good deed, they put a straw in there, preparing the manger, have it soft so when Jesus comes it will be comfortable, and also a symbol of preparing our hearts, because doing good deeds is make room for the Lord. So I do that, and then we continue learning after Christmas about Christ's childhood, and as he grows up into his ministry in adulthood, and then we get into the passion and death during the Lent and Easter time and so on. No, it's all scripture-based, and they love it, and I love doing it. And that's where I am right now.
Terrific. Let's just let people know that you're listening to KZFR FM, listener-supported community radio for the Sacramento Valley, the foothills, and beyond. You're listening to Ask Dr. Gale, and we're doing a panel on the meaning of Jesus and getting ready for Christmas. My mother started a tradition that I really recommend, that at Christmas dinner, everyone does some kind of contribution about the meaning of Jesus and Christmas. So it could be a poem, it could be a song, it could be a dance. I usually read from Luke about the birth of baby Jesus. I always make my speech, Jesus was a radical. He violated Old Testament taboos. That's why the authorities didn't like him. He said, fight for the poor, for the children, that kind of thing. Joel, why don't we kind of look at the different ways that each of you have approached your particular interests? You've done a lot with with bioethics in terms of health, like assisted suicide. You've done some work about sexuality in Protestantism. Tell us a little bit about your interests and where you've gone with it.
I think that for people who call themselves Christians, and if you ask them what is what does it mean, what is the defining characteristic of a Christian, I think you hear a lot of different voices. But I think it's interesting that just of the random sample of 4 people here, there seems to be this notion that that the world is a good world created by God. We find ourselves as human beings in a shattered kind of environment and world in which things don't seem to work. And there seems to be a way out of this. There seems to be a way that we can get our sacred destiny back, and we can, in a sense, have that relationship with God again. But within the Christian tradition, it doesn't happen without the death and resurrection of Christ, right? So when God becomes human, this becomes the way in which this is possible. And so that generates a lot of interest in theology among Protestants, Catholics, individuals, teenagers, older people, whatever. But there's also this thing at the end of the day, you've got to live a life. You have to live a life where you live, like Chico or Red Bluff, or as a refugee from Honduras or Paradise at some point in your life, or as a parent or as a weeping parent who's lost a child. I mean, all these things happen. And of course, sex and relationships and death and marriage are these cornerstone primal events in the life of human beings, right? And so a tradition that can't begin to address how do you think about the end of your life, right? Or how do you think about what is the real meaning or purpose of marriage or celibacy or sex or whatever, unless the traditions can address those issues, I think it's not going to meet the needs that human beings have as they live out these lives that can sometimes go for 90 years, right, or longer. And so, and that field of ethics and the social issues, religion and politics, sexuality and understandings of sexuality. How do we think about the withholding and withdrawing of life-sustaining treatment? How do we think about helping an individual who is irreparably dying to have a death with dignity, right? Whether it's in a hospice or whether it's through assisted suicide. So those were the things that in my 20s and 30s began to animate me as a person who wanted to have a life within this tradition, right? So many of my friends in seminary went on to become pastors. Others went on into medical missions. Others saw themselves as being educators, and most everybody here just happens to be the educator type, right? And I think we all see it as a vocation every bit as empowering or powerful as a pastor or a bishop or a cardinal or whatever. But it means that the way in which you live that life and the way in which you talk about things and the audiences to which you talk and what you can talk about and what you cannot talk about or shouldn't talk about, those become things that you have to consider. So I've taken a great interest in thinking about assisted suicide, something that I think is not that world-shattering in the world that we live in anymore, even though California is a state now where assisted suicide is permitted, as is Oregon and Washington and Montana and a few others. At the end of the day, it's an interesting policy to have, but not many people other than white college-educated middle-class people that live west of I-5 really take advantage of it, right? For most people, the crucial issues is care and succor at the end of life, things like hospice, things like the presence of physicians and nurses, the support of families in bereavement. Those kinds of issues, I think, have become much more crucial to a quality of life, even though personally I've shifted my position on assisted suicide, and I tend, in theory, to accept it. But I actually don't think it really solves many people's problems. And likewise, I think, both in the Catholic and Protestant side, the issue of sexuality has been interesting. Within the Catholic Church, for up until recently, Vatican II, Thomistic theology of the 12th century really taught about the primary and secondary ends of marriage, the procreation and the education of offspring as being a primary end, and then other ends as well, other purposes. In the Protestant tradition, things get turned on their head, right? The purpose of marriage is kind of to keep the world from coming apart, right? In the Lutheran tradition, it's not really a sacrament at all. It's just a civil service, right? It's a service just to keep, you bring people together to be married because things are worse in a world where people aren't married, right?
That's true.
And if there's one good reason to get married, it's to have illicit sex. And then some marriages will have children, right? So different traditions understand these differently. But only some approaches work, and when certain traditions like the Shakers, the Oneida community in upstate New York, or the polygamy of the Latter-day Saints becomes a practice, those traditions have either die or they have to abandon those policies for things that are much more mainstream, that look a lot more like, I would say, traditional Catholicism or Protestantism. And the Catholic and Protestant traditions have had these schismatic groups that tend to drop away for one reason or another. So everybody's grappling with it, and all of these issues. The Islamic tradition does it, the Hindu tradition does it, but those, I think, became the fascination in my career at a certain point, was the practical issues of, once you've made a commitment to live in this tradition, how do you get from 6 in the morning to 6 at night without coming apart at the seams? And ethics and values tend to be a way to do that.
Got it. Greg, you've written books about the power of no, time for yes. Could you tell us about what no and yes means in that context, and why you're so fascinated with C.S. Lewis?
Yes. Well, I think the book, The Time for Yes, was a response to my book on no, because I didn't want to become, as it were, Dr. No. But Say Yes to No came out of a time when I was just torn by so many things in my late 30s. I was pastor of a large church, with other pastors, a church of like 3,000 members. We were living in New York City. And I realized that in order to have some level of joy in life, you have to say no to lots of things and focus on something that's in front of you.
Priorities.
Priorities. And I think the book really came out of a practice of Sabbath, so it was a very Jewish Christian roots to it. Although I would just add that one of the books and authors that was so important for me was Wayne Muller's book, Sabbath, where he really engages a whole variety of practices that are for rest. So that's the no book, was to take that break, to focus, to learn how to have joy and peace out of all that. Yes was how to discern God's calling, ultimately. So once you say no, or let's put it another way, I always thought that people knew what their yeses were so they could say no to surround those and create boundaries. But I found a lot of people would ask me, I don't really know what the yeses are that I should be proclaiming. This image that I often use is of Michelangelo carving the David, and a beautiful sculpture of this incredible human form. And one of his proteges said, well, how did you carve the David? And Michelangelo said, well, I took this block of marble and I simply chipped away everything that wasn't the David, right? And so that was how I understood the no. And I remember a friend from Chico State said to me, well, I don't know what my David is. I don't know what that vision in the marble is. So anyway, that's where the yes book came. And then the C.S. Lewis book really was done almost as a debt. Not as a debt, because I don't really believe you repay things. I believe that you have gratitude that you respond out of. So that was a slip. It was more that I had this sense of gratitude for Lewis and what he had meant in my life over the years, and that I wanted to somehow give back, and perhaps write a book that was some measure of the kinds of inspiration and insight that he has given me over the years. Particularly this insight on how to have what was called a genial Christianity by Commonweal, this sense of, Lewis looked out and he saw the beauty of creation, he saw the beauty of life as it's lived, and not just life as it lived in the church or something, and that Christianity really had a positive relationship with the world around us. So that part of Lewis was so, and has continued to be so, important for me.
What about the project that you're working on with about young adults and their belief systems? What's that?
So I've been involved with trying to understand and work. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I've had Christian ministry with 18 to 30-year-olds pretty much the whole time I was a pastor, and now I still do as a professor. And so I really wanted to understand what faith looks like for emerging adults. So that's what sociologists define this 18 to 30-year-old demographic as. In other words, a lot of the markers of adulthood are being delayed, like having children and buying houses and stuff like that. And one of the things that I've done is I've interviewed students for an hour at Chico State. I've done surveys of students. I did a grant looking at what are the attitudes of 18 to 30-year-olds on faith, and particularly faith and science. And I've been fascinated because I think if we look at 18 to 30-year-olds, we know where the future is. And one huge part of the future is that, as of a survey I just read today, 46% of 18 to 30-year-olds are nuns. Not in the sense of the religious, but nuns as in N-O-N-E-S's. If you have a series of boxes to check of what religious affiliation are you, they'll check the box nun.
Right.
Which doesn't mean atheist or agnostic. Nuns will go to church and synagogue and other places. They definitely don't, a small percentage, a minority of nuns are atheists or agnostics, maybe about 20% of nuns, but still about...
They're not affiliated.
They're not affiliating, right? And they're not finding spiritual, a source of spiritual growth in the church. And they don't want to affiliate with the church for that reason. A lot of it, I think, is being anti-science. A lot of it is the church's affiliation with extremely conservative politics. I mean, it's not just my opinion. These are surveys have indicated this. So,
right.
So I've really been trying to understand this and see what it means for the future of our country, for the future of the church, and so on. And I'm just fascinated by it.
Yeah.
I just happen to really enjoy being around 20-somethings because it was such an important part of my life, and I think it's such an important part in human development to make big decisions at that point.
I've been studying global youth activism and attitudes for over a decade. I have books out about it, if that ever intrigues you.
Yeah.
But that's definitely what we're finding is they're really egalitarian, they're not judgmental, but they are skeptical about religious, political organizations that they view as corrupt.
Right.
So they don't really want to identify with I'm a this or I'm a that.
Right. And
they care about people.
They really care about people. I know you do work in spirituality that doesn't always fit into the box of a particular religious tradition. It would be really wonderful to talk with you about that. But I think one of the things I've found is my image has been that they'll do more of a Spotify or Pandora mix of religion instead of the LP version, you know? So when I was in the college, I went to the record store and bought an LP, and you played it side one, Seratum, right through, played side two, right? It was how one artist put it together. Now, and so like you play the Catechism of the Presbyterian Church, and you decide, do I want to listen to this whole thing or not? You just play it or not. Now I think students are saying, and 20-somethings, I'm gonna have a lot of different inputs, and they may or may not even have to be entirely compatible in some philosophical sense. But students are much more comfortable with all kinds of different religions or other spiritualities that popularly we wouldn't call religious. In the Guild, we call religion a wide variety of things. Religion and spirituality are very close in the Guild, but to the popular press and speech, this would be all kinds of spiritual inputs are really important. So what I'm trying to say is it's much more varied, much more, I think people are much more open to all kinds of different inputs.
Right. What are you finding, Virginia or Sister Gloria, about attracting young people to the church? And men. I mean, if you go to a church service, it's mostly women, correct?
Yes.
So what is the church doing to reach out to young people and men?
Well, I know one thing that the church has is the educational systems, the schools, and there's also their catechism well, I don't want to use the word catechism, but that's religious training. In light of, I really don't know all that is being done with regard to the broader picture. And I probably should be, but I don't. Maybe Virginia does.
Good segue.
Well, in our particular parish, we have small groups. Sometimes they're Bible studies, sometimes we have a program now called Arise, and it is kind of like a Bible study because we do study a scripture each week. But the beautiful thing that evolves from that is the community among the group. Maybe there's 10 people in that group. And there's one group or two that are the millennials, so to speak, and they're raising their little children, and they're very supportive. How do we do this so they keep our faith and that sort of thing? I don't have the answers to all of that. In fact, we have a lot of men in our church, but we have fewer young than we do older.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'd like to see more of. I don't know what the answer is to that. It's a bigger issue than my little mind can grasp a solution.
Well, it's interesting that, like in Latin America, in Africa, there's a lot of growing evangelical churches. So young people get into the singing and dancing and speaking in tongues or whatever. Any thoughts about that,
Yeah,
Joel?
it's huge. I mean, the growth of Christianity in what's called the global South, right? Southern Hemisphere, poor, non-white. Christianity is the fastest growing religion. It is the largest religion.
But it's the evangelicals,
And it's
right?
the evangelical, the Pentecostal churches. You know, even I have to say, even if you're not an evangelical or a Pentecostal, you have to admire them in this sense, which is that they do the ages of 9 through 29 pretty well. That is, there's a way in which evangelicalism has been able to grab and hold many people through those very formative years. Though, you know, they are struggling with attendance issues and growth and consistency issues the way other denominations are, other traditions seem to do other aspects of the tradition better, perhaps. So, you know, the energy, the lack of hierarchy, the opportunities for the poor, for women to have leadership roles, means that in Protestantism, it's the evangelicals and Pentecostals, and they are, you know, getting membership among the global South.
Because they deal with the emotions. They're
Yeah,
not
they're very
lecturing.
exactly.
That's it.
They tend to be more spontaneous. They tend to be less liturgical, less hierarchical. They tend to be very conservative socially and politically, but in terms of the energy of life, they seem to have a certain vibrancy, and that combination is what seems to capture, you know, the imagination of, I think, a lot of people, and some even in this country.
And
Oh,
I
yeah.
think music plays a big role in that.
Mm-hmm.
That it's appealing, it's alive, and that also helps in the energizing. It's not just the message, it's how you present the message and how you involve them.
Yeah.
I think is a key thing.
I'm
As
gonna
you were-
go ahead.
Good. I flashed on the mind when you talk about the nuns.
Nuns,
Nuns.
yeah.
No
and
religious, but
Yeah.
that actually, I think the Sisters of Mercy in Burlingame have received like $10,000 grant, and their purpose is to work directly with the nuns, and I think they actually live there. Just a couple of them live at our center in Burlingame.
Mercy Center?
Mercy Center
Yeah.
in Burlingame.
Oh.
I think there were 4 or 5, maybe 2 or 3 men or whatever.
Yeah.
And this has just developed in the last month or two, and it came over on our weekly messenger, but I can't say a little bit more, and I wish I had pursued that, because it was some granting system that they asked us, vote for.
Oh.
So that's what got me into it. I knew the sisters that were involved, so I was voting, every chance I get. So I think they won some money to have a program like this, and that's exactly
Yeah.
what it was.
We have 4 more minutes, so I need to thank some more sponsors. Ask Dr. Gale is made possible by the generous contributions of KZFR supporters and by Cotton Party, which is right down below, offering fine quality natural fiber clothing and accessories in the heart of downtown Chico. Cotton Party has been providing friendly service for over 30 years at 337 Broadway and is open Monday through Saturday from 10 till 5. You can call Cotton Party at 893-4923. Shop locally at Cotton Party next to Chico Paper Company and Birkenstock. Ask Dr. Gale is also brought to you by Grid Alternatives, installing solar power in underserved communities at no cost to homeowners since 2011. I haven't heard of that. Serving Chico and surrounding communities, GRID is the nation's largest nonprofit solar installer. You all heard of that before? Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Providing benefits for both homeowners and the environment while training solar workers for the solar industry. Call 530-217-6115 or visit gridsolar.org to see if you qualify. So you've been listening to Ask Dr. Gale. The second Thursday in January, my show is going to be about Native American, local indigenous peoples issues. And I thought we'd end with, what would you like people to think about at Christmas in terms of the birth of Jesus? Why don't we start with Virginia, like a sentence?
That God is with us, that He loves us, and what a grace it would be to be able to do everything we do for His glory and to live in His presence.
Sister Gloria.
I was concerned all of a sudden that the microphone wasn't there,
It's there.
and I really can't think right now. I'm going to pass it on.
You can go back, right? You can
We'll
take it
come
down.
back to
I'm the
you.
introvert.
Yeah.
I have to think of
Okay, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would. I think I would have a very similar sense, Virginia, to what you said. I mean, I think the message of Jesus and the vulnerability of the child is something that really touches our hearts and reminds us of how intimate and how fragile this God is, who the Christian Church has worshipped and does worship as the God of the universe and the God of creation, and yet comes with a message of love that is vulnerable and that cares for the poor and the oppressed. I think that's what I'd love to have people take in 2018.
Joel.
I would say read the Gospel of Luke. You know, it's an interesting text to read. You can do it in about an hour and 15 minutes if you sit down. But what you'll notice is it's actually an opera. The whole thing is built around music, right?
Really?
Oh my gosh, yes. So you've got the Song of Zechariah, who sings when he gets his voice back after his son John is born. You get Mary singing this beautiful piece, the Magnificat, after the angel tells her what's about to happen. You get the angels breaking through on a dark evening overlooking a kind of burned outside of a mountain outside of Chico, singing this music that there is this tumultuous moment that is happening to the universe. So think about the musical scores behind those pieces in the Gospel of Luke, and that, I think, expresses very clearly what those early Christian writers were experiencing when they put these Gospels together. 50, 70, 60, 70 years after Jesus' birth and death, these texts were coming together, but they decided that it was the opera that needed to be the one that eventually got into the New Testament. So
Well, we come back to the evangelicals and their use of music. Can I put you on the spot? If you were talking to an 8-year-old about the meaning of Jesus and his birth and Christmas, what would you say to the 8-year-old?
You know, you have a God that really loves you, and we celebrate that God coming with us at this particular time. We do it in many different ways, and one of them is to give gifts. And I would hope that your gifts become meaningful, that they mean a lot for you, that you give of yourself when you give the gift, and you have a great appreciation for all the love and gifts that you get from other people, especially your parents.
That's touching. Do you want to add some?
Can I just tell a most adorable story about a 5-year-old and Christmas story?
Very short.
Very short, just interrupted. But, there's this little boy, he's 5. He is abandoned by his parents. He has severe ADHD. And his grandmother was raising him and was concerned about him being in church because he just can't sit still. He crawls under the pews and he talks out loud and impulsive and so forth. So last Sunday, he sat between us because she asked me to help. And so I tried to contain him. I know him pretty well. And there came a point where he was on his drawing pad, and I drew the Star of Bethlehem. And I started to put the race down, and I was telling what this was all about. And I drew the angels and the manger and Mary and Joseph and the animals, and he was just taken up with that. Then I found out, this lasted maybe 2 minutes, then I found out that when he went home, instead of listening to all the animated cartoons he had a collection of, he wanted to see the little movie about Jesus was born. And his grandma said he watched that over and over and over for hours. Something touched his heart.
Thank you, panel. It's been so interesting. We could go on for a lot more hours, I feel like. So stay tuned, and thank you for your patience, Sandra, to Peanut Butter and Jelly Time. Go, Sandra. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks,
I
Gail.
really do
Great.
feel like we could keep going.
I know, there's so much to be said. Very nice to meet